The year was 1943. The USA had been involved in World War II for a couple of years, and during that summer on the high seas, US destroyers and other Allied ships were involved in a bloody battle with German U-boat submarines. The Battle of the Atlantic would become the longest continuous military campaign of the war, and it would take thousands and thousands of lives belonging to the Allied forces and the German military. Shipyards in Britain, the US, and Canada were more than busy, but it was at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard where something special, something verging on the utterly fantastic, was supposedly taking place. This would become known as the Philadelphia Experiment, and now we're going to tell you how that allegedly went down. As the story goes, at that American shipyard in Philadelphia, a new destroyer was being built, and it went by the name of the USS Eldridge. But this was no ordinary destroyer, far from it. It was being equipped with technology no country had or even had heard about. This technology was related to something called electrical field manipulation, and what this did was make the ship invisible to everyone else. This apparently came to fruition on July 22, 1943. We're told on this day, in front of government and military officials, the scientists disappeared the ship with crew intact, right in front of their eyes. A witness said he heard the generators buzz, and then a strange blue light seemed to encapsulate the destroyer, and then, poof, it was gone. To say the least, the onlookers were completely baffled. To baffle them even more, there are reports that the Eldridge appeared somewhere else at another shipyard in another part of the US and then reappeared back in Philadelphia. That's one story anyhow, because another story says those scientists didn't introduce teleportation until later that year in October. Some accounts even say that when the ship came back, there were sailors on board, but some of them had been fused to various parts of the steel. Some of these people were apparently mangled and broken, which adds some amount of horror to the tale. Apparently, when the ship was teleported in the second experiment and just appeared in the water near the Philadelphia shipyard, someone saw it, and he was aboard another ship, the SS Andrew Forsyth. It sounds like an outlandish tale, but a lot of people believe it's true. Now we must try and separate fact from fiction. So we'll introduce an astronomer and science fiction writer named Morris K. Jessup. Some reports said he'd been in touch with an anonymous person who had been on the Andrew Forsyth, although later accounts say the writer was told about the experiments by a guy named Carl Meredith Allen. We can't tell you much about him, but he's been called a UFO conspiracy theorist and a publicity seeker. You can tell us if that's true at the end of the show. Jessup lived an embattled life. He was an educated man who became an astronomer, but his real love was writing books. He wrote some books on UFOs in the 1950s, notably his The Case for the UFO in 1955. This book did okay, and he believed he could make a living from writing. His second book didn't do well though, and subsequently his manuscripts that followed were rebuffed by his publisher. To make matters worse, his wife left him in 1958. A year later, he was depressed and despondent. Although, as the tale goes, he called one of his friends to tell her that he had something important to say regarding the Philadelphia experiment. A day later, he was found dead. His body was found inside a car. A hose had been connected to the window from the exhaust pipe, and the engine had been turned on. He'd apparently taken his own life and died after inhaling the fumes. This has of course led conspiracy theorists to say that he was killed because he knew too much about the secret experiments conducted by the US military, although his friends later came out and said he had talked about killing himself for weeks, even months. That's the sad story of Morris Jessup. Now back to this guy named Carl Meredith Allen, the person who first said he had seen the experiments with his own eyes. He wrote about 50 letters to Jessup relating what he had seen, but at the time he used the name Carlos Miguel Allende. Sometimes he'd say he'd been taught by the great Albert Einstein, and he claimed to understand something called unified field theory. This was a theory introduced by Einstein, and it's not easy to explain in a few words. The dictionary definition is this: a theory that describes two or more of the four interactions, electromagnetic, gravitational, weak, and strong, previously described by separate theories. Or as Live Science put it, a field theory refers generally to why physical phenomena happens and why these phenomena interact with nature. Anyway, we're guessing Carlos Miguel Allende didn't understand it, and he certainly had no proof of it being anything but a theory. To this day, it's never been proven. But Allende wrote to Jessup saying he was sure the theory was possible because he'd seen a ship disappear and that was proof. The thing was, he was the only person at the time who said he'd seen this happen. We should add that some people say it was this delusional man that partly drove Jessup to hooking up his car with the noxious hose. Jessup did at least try to investigate the claim, but there was just no evidence. Allende kept pestering him, saying that it was true, and this frustrated Jessup. In 1957, the Navy's Office of Naval Research even approached Jessup and Allen told him they had received something strange in the post. The package contained one of Jessup's UFO books, but inside were scribbled notes describing extraterrestrial technology and ramblings about unified field theory. Yeah, Allende had done that, although it was supposed to look like the notes had been made by 3 people or 2 people plus an alien. It gets stranger though, because the Office of Naval Research then actually published 127 copies of this book with the added parts. This stress, along with his wife leaving him and his career on the line, no doubt was too much for Jessup. As for Allende, he lived to a ripe old age and died in 1994. During his lifetime, Allende would confess that the whole thing was a hoax, but then later he would change his mind and say it was fact. This is why some people have said he was a delusional publicity seeker. But to those people that believed in UFOs and that the USA has always been doing out-of-this-world stuff at its various black sites, what Allende said was gasoline on a fire. It doesn't help matters that anyone who wants to can see the seaman certificate of Carl Meredith Allen. We've seen it. So if any part of this story is true, it's the fact that he was a seaman. Then, things got even weirder in the 1980s. That's because someone decided to make a movie called The Philadelphia Experiment. Now, we all know that we shouldn't believe everything we've seen on the big screen. But for one man watching this film brought back some memories. His name was Al Bielek. And while the film came out in 1984, he watched it 4 years later. He claimed to have watched the movie, and after that, his repressed memories about the actual Philadelphia experiment came back to him. He said he'd also seen the ship Teletransport. He also claimed to have traveled into the future and seen the mid-21st century. He said he'd been part of something called the Montauk Project. And among other weird things, it was concerned with time travel. According to Bielek, he'd been on board the USS Eldridge when it disappeared. He claimed to have been in the body of another man and been with that man's brother. He said that when the ship disappeared, they both decided to jump overboard, but instead of hitting water, they drifted through clouds until they passed out. When they woke up, they were in a hospital somewhere. They were covered in radiation burns, but what really got their attention was the fact that they were in the year 2137. This all came back to him after seeing that movie. There was more, too, that came back. For instance, he said he'd visited the 28th century. He said cities were then governed by computer systems. At that time, the world was populated by only 300 million people. He made more outrageous claims, such as visiting Mars or describing one of his sojourns in the year of 6037. There was nothing to back up any of this, of course. In 1994, a French astrophysicist and ufologist, Jacques F. Vallée, wrote a piece called Anatomy of a Hoax, the Philadelphia Experiment 50 years later. He asked people to read it and come forward if they knew anything about this alleged experiment. One person did, and his name was Edward Dudgeon. He had served in the U.S. Navy during the Second World War. Dudgeon said that during the 1940s, the USA did actually try in some ways to make ships invisible, but it's not what you might think. What they tried to do was wrap electrical cable around the hulls of ships to try to make the ships not visible to underwater mines and magnetic torpedoes. This is hardly paranormal stuff. The Germans had been planting such mines and using magnetic weapons. Those mines were supposed to connect to any passing ships, so the Americans attempted to make that impossible. He said that this process was called degaussing, and that he added at the time that there was this talk of being something that made ships invisible. You could call what happened next the result of Chinese whispers. People talked about invisible ships, and it seems some of them took this literally, not just relating to ships being able to evade magnetic weapons. Furthermore, in 1999, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a piece about sailors who had served on the USS Eldridge. They said at the time, when it was supposed to have disappeared in Philadelphia, it was actually in Brooklyn. The ship's logs also said that this was a fact. All the sailors who'd been aboard the ship agreed, and so it seems Dudgeon's account of why the hoax manifested is quite credible. Nonetheless, the conspiracy theorists just say that this is the military covering up what really happened. They'll tell you that the sailors had been forced to say that, and indeed, someone somewhere can make great hunks of metal just disappear. It's just a pity no one in this world has seen that happen since. Our conclusion is that the Philadelphia experiment is about as plausible as the existence of UFOs or that mythical beast in Scotland, the Loch Ness Monster. We believe that Allende likely had mental problems and Jessup was just unfortunate to get caught up in the mess. As for the time-traveling Bielek who'd broken bread with folks in the year of 6037, we dare to say that we think that man was out of his mind. But do you agree with our conclusion? Can you offer any evidence to the contrary? Tell us in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video, How Did a Whole Village Disappear? The Lost Colony of Roanoke Mystery. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.